It's very clear that flash flood events, due to rainfall that's very heavy, are becoming more severe.
Floods are more costly, more frequent, more disrupting than any of the other natural disasters. We need to help people relocate to get out of the danger zone.
We just can't pack up and move. These are sacred grounds.
I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. I have been a radio journalist for 2 decades, but a few years ago, I found myself avoiding the news for long stretches because of how depressing and divisive it all seems. I still wanted to be informed and engaged on important issues, though, and I figured I couldn't be alone in that. So we created this podcast. Each week, we tackle one tough topic in a way that will challenge you, help you feel more empathy, and empower you to become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor, and a more effective advocate. Today, facing a growing flood problem that matters more than you think.
When 1999 came and they were talking about a flood, I was just in disbelief. I did not believe it.
Bobby Jones is from Princeville, a small town in eastern North Carolina, right on the Tar River. In '99, the remnants of Hurricane Floyd dropped so much rain, the river overflowed.
Saturday morning, I got a phone call, and my sister asked me, what was I still doing there? And I was like, what are you talking about? She said, they evacuated the entire vicinity last night.
The emergency responders had missed him.
They told me they knocked on the door. I didn't answer, so they left. I can imagine them knocking that hard that I would sleep through something like that, but I did. So I walked outside, and the water was about ankle deep, and I'm still in disbelief. I did not believe it was going to flood. But then I noticed the water kept rising and rising and rising, and I waited too late. The water got on the porch, and I started thinking about how can I get out of here, thinking about getting on the rooftop. But I saw the helicopter flying over, so I started waving to the helicopter and kept going. They did that 3 times, and on the 3rd time, they dropped their harness down, and they pulled me to safety. Every building, every home was totally destroyed, but thankfully, not one life was lost. And that's a credit to our emergency management team and our volunteer fire department, getting people out, letting them know that it was real. Unfortunately, I was the only one that they couldn't get out, but thankfully I made it out on the harness.
Bobby Jones was in his 40s at the time. He was born and raised in Princeville, but he'd never seen anything close to the 1999 flood. So he and most others in town rebuilt their homes, confident they'd survived a once-in-a-lifetime fluke of nature.
We thought 99 was it, never again. But of course, 16, it woke us up again.
2016, Princeville was wiped out by flooding from another hurricane. Again, the town rebuilt, and Bobby Jones is now the mayor.
Now at the forefront is flood risk. How are we going to protect our citizens? How are we going to protect our town?
Floods are the most common of all weather-related disasters in America. They cause more damage and kill more people than any other type of severe weather. The majority of deaths from hurricanes, in fact, are actually caused by flooding from the storm. And the risk is rising as the climate warms. Hotter temperatures are making rainstorms more intense. Flash floods are happening more often and in more places. And the communities facing the greatest risk in the coming decades are disproportionately poor and Black. But here's the thing. Damage from flooding is the most preventable of all natural disasters.
Our response has been to build dams to try to stop floods, to build levees to keep them away from us, to pay for relief after the damage is done, to insure people when they're going to get flooded. But what we have not done is simply get out of the way. And that, in fact, is the only thing that really works.
That's Tim Palmer, author of the book Seek Higher Ground, the natural solution to our urgent flooding crisis. Getting out of the way works, sure. But it's complicated by a lot of things like money, history, and basic psychology that makes us prone to thinking, it won't happen to me. Well, today we'll hear how cities and individuals are grappling with growing flood risk. And we'll get back to Palmer's argument about getting out of the way. But first, why do hotter temperatures mean more floods? Shouldn't it be the opposite? hotter means drier.
I call it the expanding atmospheric sponge effect.
Daniel Swain is a climate scientist
With UCLA and the National Center for Atmospheric Research.
and he has a popular YouTube channel called Weather West. Now, Swain says that as the Earth's temperature has risen by 2 degrees over the last century and continues to break new heat records,
The water vapor holding capacity of the atmosphere increases. It's actually an exponential increase for a linear increase in temperature.
which means the atmosphere is becoming a much bigger sponge, capable of extracting more water from the Earth's surface.
Now, that assumes that the water is available, of course. If you just have a sponge on a dry counter, it's not going to absorb anything, but its potential to absorb something grows as the sponge increases. So you can imagine is that if you did spill all that water on the kitchen counter, if there was water available to evaporate, for example, you could wring out a lot more water out of that sponge. That's why the precipitation becomes more intense, because when there was water for the sponge to evaporate, wringing out that progressively bigger sponge is the equivalent of increasingly extreme precipitation events.
So where does the big sponge in the sky get the water then? There's a bigger sponge because temperatures are warmer. Where's that water coming from?
Well, most of the water comes from bodies of water around the world, mostly the oceans, because of course those are the largest bodies of water on the Earth, but also to a certain extent rivers and lakes and even the soil itself. Anywhere where their soil isn't completely bone dry, there's some water that can evaporate directly out of the ground and transpire from plants.
So a bigger sponge in the sky makes drought and flooding worse.
What really happens is the ceiling on how intense precipitation can become is rising in a warming climate. So you do get more extreme events when conditions are favorable, but at other times you might actually be getting less rain. And so we start to see this notion of increasing whiplash, this variation between drier dries in many places and wetter wets. And of course, it's the wetter wets that are driving, in many cases, this increase in these floods that develop quickly due to rainfall that's very heavy over just anywhere from 20 minutes to a few hours that we've seen recently in places like New York City, but also Southern California, San Diego, floods that resulted from very heavy precipitation that fell essentially from thunderstorm-like downpours over just an hour or two. It's very clear that those sorts of flash flood events are becoming more severe, mainly because those hourly cloudbursts are getting more intense as the water vapor holding capacity of the atmosphere increases quickly with warming temperatures.
Is that where we're talking about these like 100-year flood, 1,000-year flood? What do we even mean when someone says, wow, this thing that really just happened, in X state in X month was a 1,000-year flood?
Yeah, I mean, and those are some complicated terms to talk about too, because I think there's a notion that we talk about, say, the 100-year flood or the 1,000-year flood. It's some event that occurs on maybe a recurring 100-year cycle or a recurring 1,000-year cycle, and that's actually not what it means at all. To the best of our knowledge, there are no cycles. It just means that the 100-year flood is a flood that, on average, you would only see once in any given 100-year period. But there's no physical reason why you couldn't get 3 of them in a decade if you were very unlucky.
Swain says smaller floods, predicted to happen once every 5 or 10 years, don't seem to be getting more frequent. In some places, they're happening less because the ground is so dry it can soak up more rain when it falls.
But the most extreme floods, of course, the ones that cause the most problems, are precisely those which are most likely to increase the most. What was once the 100-year flood probably isn't the 100-year flood anymore. What happens if a 100-year flood becomes twice as likely? Well, then it's the 50-year flood. Still unlikely, right? Still only a 1 in 50 chance in any given year. But all of a sudden, it goes from something that many of us would never experience in our lives. Most of us aren't fortunate enough to live to 100, to something that most of us would, because most of us are lucky enough to live past 50. So that actually ends up being a pretty tangible difference.
And this is happening across the country, says Swain.
There's still hotspot regions. There are some places where the risk is increasing faster than others. And in the United States, it appears to be the case that right along the Gulf Coast, Texas and Louisiana and Florida and the others, and the eastern seaboard, so especially the upper eastern seaboard, thinking about New York and Massachusetts and Maryland, these are all places that have seen a lot of very severe flash floods in recent years. I mean, just think of any number of recent news stories just about New York City specifically, and the number of times that Manhattan has seen rivers coursing down its streets in recent years and all those basement apartments flooding. We've seen a lot of that.
So outside of those flashpoint areas then, so let's say, Midwestern areas along large rivers, the Mississippi, for example, or the Ohio River, are those areas where there's less likelihood of the real escalation that you've described?
So the dynamics at play are a little bit different, and that's where it gets a little bit fuzzier with the big river flooding that takes weeks to even months to accumulate. There, the land surface conditions become increasingly important. Flooding is not just a product of the precipitation, but it's also a product of course, how dry things were leading up to it. So is the soil moisture really high or really low? That can affect things. But also the built environment. Did we build a bunch of subdivisions in the floodplain that weren't there the last time there was a big flood? Did we pave over a bunch of watersheds, or did we fill in a bunch of wetlands? So when we're asking the question of people, potentially in harm's way, that's not just a question about the magnitude or the frequency of the floods themselves, but it's also a function of where people live and how we've modified the landscape. And in a lot of cases, we've modified it in ways that greatly increase the risk, maybe even more than climate change has. In some places, the main risk increases just because there's 500,000 people living in a floodplain that weren't there 50 years ago.
Daniel Swain is a climate scientist at UCLA and the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. Thank you so much for your time today, Professor.
Thanks very much for having me.
Why have we done so much building and paving in water's way?
The nugget of the problem here is that just as human beings and as a society, we tend to regard the laws of nature as optional.
Next on Top of Mind, a brief history of disastrous decisions about the most common of natural disasters. I'm Julie Rose. Hey, Top of Mind listeners, I have another podcast I want to recommend to you. It's from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, and it's called The Appleseed. It's a show filled with stories for you and your family. Each episode features master storytellers sharing all kinds of stories, folk tales, fairy tales, personal and family tales. So it's perfect for road trips, for bedtime, or really anytime you're looking for something that the whole family can enjoy together. And the stories you'll hear will likely get your family sharing their own stories with each other, which is really the best part. It's the payoff. So listen to The Appleseed wherever you get your podcasts. Tim Palmer was a land use planner in the 1970s when he lived through a catastrophic flood and had an epiphany.
We need to help people relocate to get out of the danger zone wherever that's possible to do.
June 1972.
I was living in north central Pennsylvania in the Appalachian Mountains working as a county planner. The storm began and it didn't stop.
It was the remnant of Hurricane Agnes,
which had blown up the East Coast with minor effects, but then had gone out to sea, picking up more moisture and returning again.
And Palmer's Pennsylvania mountain town was at the epicenter.
This muddy, fast-flowing water rose and came within one step of the first floor. I had moved all my valuable things up to a second floor. Fortunately, I had one. And then I just kind of looked out the window as the storm continued and the water rose higher.
The water never made it into the home he was renting, but many of his neighbors weren't so lucky.
Some of them were flooded up to their first story. So they had this brown, pretty darn foul water, all over the ground floor of their house, and basically lost everything that was there, like their carpets and appliances and that kind of thing. Their front yards became stacked high with stuff that was on the way to the dump. And upstream, there was an area with 60 mobile homes on the floodplain. And at the crest of the flood, I went down to the riverbank below my house and watched those waves rolling by with entire mobile homes, still intact, floating by. Others of them, decapitated and cut into pieces, and floating furniture and appliances and log driftwood, kind of pulverizing everything. And again, it just made you realize, oh my God, this thing is way bigger than we are. We have got to do something else here. We've got to take this seriously.
It was the most damaging and expensive flood the U.S. had experienced up to that point. Palmer was inspired to become an environmental writer and an evangelist for flood prevention. His latest book is Seek Higher Ground, the natural solution to our urgent flooding crisis.
Floods cause tremendous amounts of damage. The irony is that the approach our society and government has taken ever since early floods in the 1800s is to try to control nature and stop the floods. And that has been a colossal failure.
Living next to rivers has always been irresistible, says Palmer. It was a practical choice back before plumbing, electricity, and motor vehicles were invented. Today, it's more about aesthetics and lifestyle.
A lot of people like the view. Of course, we love living on the waterfront. And so people have built there. Entire cities have developed. And so the floods keep coming. It was just natural for the knee-jerk response to be, oh, stop the flood or keep the flood away from the city. Pittsburgh is a very pivotal example in this phenomenon. The approach to government early in our nation's history was the less the better. That was in regard to floods also. So Pittsburgh flooded, that was Pittsburgh's problem. But the flood of 1936 was so extreme and so widespread that it really stimulated Congress to act, to take a much deeper role in flood control. Pittsburgh was already there. They needed dams. They couldn't afford to build the dams themselves, but the Army Corps of Engineers ended up building 11 dams to try to prevent flooding in Pittsburgh. And so the expectation was created that the government could solve this problem by building dams. It couldn't. It can't. It didn't. It won't. And yet we tend to still believe in it, even though we see dams filling up and spilling over and dam failures and whatnot all the time. And the really big floods of the future are going to make those hazards even greater. So historically, we just came to rely on the government too much to solve our problem when it really can't do that.
How did the Army Corps of Engineers come to be such a dam building? I mean, if Pittsburgh was the beginning, that was just the beginning of what would become a dam building spree, right? I mean.
Yeah, this was really interesting to me because as a planner and as an environmentalist and all that, through the 70s and 80s, the Corps was easily regarded as just the dam builders. But in fact, going way, way back into the late 1800s, there were Army Corps reports and leaders and individuals that said, we've got to get development off the floodplain. We've just got to do that as number one here. They got nowhere. They were ignored totally. The primary approach of the Corps for 100 years was to build levees. So they built levees on the Mississippi River, piling up dirt and rock to keep the river at bay. Go figure, it's the third largest river in the world. It drains 45% of the United States. How are we going to keep that? How are we going to tame that? And they couldn't.
But they were doing that, but the motive was because there were already cities and towns built along the river. And so it was a response to the fact that people had already built there. Now we got to protect them.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And even just farmland there. I mean, we've levied thousands of miles that are only farmland because that was the approach. The Corps itself opposed building dams up until 1936 when Congress told them to do it. And then the Army Corps became passionate about the subject, and did plans to dam every significant river in America, and in fact built 400 flood control dams before the big dam building era of America finally came to an end.
Why? Why did the era of big dam construction come to an end?
Well, because 400 flood control dams, there are there are 90,000 dams altogether and sizable dams in the United States. 400 are major flood control dams of the Army Corps. And those 400 hit pretty much every site where it made any sense to build a flood control dam, plus a lot of ones that did not. So if you're going to build a flood control dam today, you're talking about the 401st most feasible site, which is not very feasible. So simple economics brought most of that program to a halt.
But all of those dams have prevented flood damage. I mean,
yes.
Without them, there would have been a lot more catastrophic flooding, right?
Right. I have a 300-page book that says we need to do something different than what we've done in the past. But I make a very important disclaimer there that the levees we built and the dams we've built aren't universally a mistake by any means. They have stopped a lot of flood damage, but they haven't stopped all of it. And in fact, because we have not paired those flood controls with regulations on development, the hazards have only increased because people think they're protected, but they're not. And they're not most graphically in the cases where the floods exceed those that were expected and the dams overflow. That's happening more and more. And so the bottom line is the flood control dams and the levees protect us from the small and the medium-sized floods, but not the big ones. And the big ones are the ones that really count.
The big one Tim Palmer lived through in 1972 gave him an intimate look at each of those failures.
I went back to work as the county's environmental planner. And my job now was to try to figure out what to do in the future to avoid this kind of catastrophe in the years to come. And so that led me, actually very quickly in the Agnes flood, that led me to recognize that the dams that had been built filled up and spilled, that the levees had been built like at Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, had failed. 100,000 people flooded in that one city because of a levee failure. It led me to realize how the relief paid to all my neighbors who were flood victims really didn't do anything but just pay for the shoveling of some mud and getting them back on their feet again. And the flood insurance program at that time was in its infancy, and virtually no one had flood insurance anyway. So in one kind of mental picture, I was able to grasp how our approach to flooding had not worked very well.
Palmer realized that there was no map of the natural floodplain in his community to let property owners and buyers know they were at higher risk.
So first day back to work, I went to my boss, Jerry Walsh, and said, Jerry, we've got to map the floodplain in Lycoming County, Pennsylvania. Jerry said, go for it. And fortunately, at the national level, there was a whole symbiotic kind of relationship here because the flood insurance program had started several years before, but it was not funded adequately. It was not taken seriously. Almost nobody bought flood insurance. Nobody really had to. But the Hurricane Agnes flood showed the federal officials that we need to make this program more effective. And to do that, they applied a brilliant strategy, which was to recognize that the federal government is left holding the bag when people have flood damage because they default on their mortgages, which are federally insured. So the hook became that the federal government would subsidize insurance for those who already lived on the floodplain if the community would take action to discourage, if not forbid, future development on the floodplain and increasing damages in the future. That was the carrot and stick bargain that was made at the time. Unfortunately, it has not worked out that way. Damages have continued to increase. What originally were intended to be kind of restrictions with teeth were all watered down in time by political pressure of people who didn't want controls.
So the carrot of the National Flood Insurance Program kicked in, but the stick dropped. Communities continued to allow new development in high-risk flood areas, and the subsidized insurance gave people an incentive to stay instead of relocate.
The National Flood Insurance Program is a classic example of the law of unintended consequences. For one great example here, and I think actually the most outrageous abuse of the program, people who get flood damage repeatedly can continue to collect federal flood insurance for the losses. And this problem has reached extreme levels in cases like trophy home development along our seacoasts, where people invest millions of dollars, they build a house that we know is going to flood from both rainfall and hurricane damage at the ocean. Some of them have collected damages 19 and 20 times for amounts far, far exceeding the total value of the house. And yet we keep, as taxpayers, we keep paying for that over and over, which acts as an incentive for those who really don't care about the inconvenience, like somebody owning a rental property. It's an incentive for them to just rebuild again, they get paid for it, rebuild again, they get paid for it, and the taxpayers are left holding the bag. Meanwhile, people who are displaced from their homes and have no other place to live get shortchanged because so much of the money of the program is spent on repeatedly flooded properties.
So what would be the right fix then to this flood insurance and unintended consequences?
To fix the National Flood Insurance Program, we need to do a lot of things, but critical among them are we need to have local communities more effectively zone areas for non-development in floodplains. We need to see that they effectively enforce those requirements. We need to stop repeated damage payments, one after another. We need to require disclosure of flood hazards in the sale of properties. And we need to revise the pay structure for how much people pay for flood insurance. As it has been, people with very valuable properties end up soaking up a whole lot of the payments out for damage, leaving little money left for everyone else.
Is there a recognition on the federal level? And is there anything that the federal government, that Congress could do to encourage the relocation, in addition to the discouraging of future development in flood areas?
Absolutely. There is a lot that the federal government does to encourage people to relocate out of the flood zone. And there are very successful programs doing that. But relative to the total amount of federal expense for floods, it's a drop in the bucket. For every $1.70 spent helping people move out of flood zones and relocate, we, the federal government, spends $100 helping people stay by paying for rebuilding, for flood proofing, in quotes, and so forth. So there are wonderful programs helping people relocate. Nashville has a great program. Tulsa has a great program. Mecklenburg County, which is Charlotte, North Carolina, has a great program. Many other cities and towns do. But they amount to a drop in the bucket of total expense and total engagement of the federal and state and local governments, which are still heavily oriented toward helping people stay. Now, one of the really pervasive problems here is a lot of people want to stay. And so we're up against that, but there are also a lot of people who want to move, and FEMA has way more applications for people who want help in moving than they have money to help them pay for. So we need to amp up that program and recognize this is the only real solution, and the way we spend money should reflect that fact.
Tim Palmer, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Julie. It's been great talking about flooding with you.
Palmer's book is Seek Higher Ground, the natural solution to our urgent flooding crisis. Now, when it comes to getting out of the way, Tulsa knows what works.
We really took what used to be the most flood-prone city in the United States, and we've turned it into a world model on how to deal with flood mitigation.
Next on Top of Mind, the tough choices cities face in the flood zone. I'm Julie Rose. We'll be right back. Hey friends, if you are looking for another great show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, check out Constant Wonder. Host Marcus Smith takes you on an exhilarating journey through captivating stories of our magnificent natural world. You'll gain profound insight into different facets of our planet, discover more about nature, and maybe even ponder your connection to Earth's wonder. The show is Constant Wonder, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. Tulsa, Oklahoma was built to flood, which makes Joseph Kralachek's job pretty tricky.
I'm the emergency manager for the Tulsa Area Emergency Management Agency. We are centered on the Arkansas River, which is a prairie river. Prairie rivers, by their very nature, want to shift and move. And we've built a city on this, and we're expecting the river to stay in one place. And so a lot of it is topography. A lot of it is the amount of rainfall that we actually receive. We average more than 80 inches of rainfall a year. Tulsa used to be the most flood-prone city in the United States. We averaged one presidentially declared disaster every 2 years for flooding. Pretty much from the 1900s up until we really decided to deal with flooding after the 1984 event.
Memorial Day, 1984. A cool front stalled over Tulsa, dumping 15 inches of rain that caused a major creek in the area to jump its banks and inundate the city. 14 people died. Thousands of buildings were destroyed. It was the worst flood in Tulsa's history, and the moment city officials decided they could no longer rely on levees, dams, and luck.
We've learned better building codes to utilize, stricter enforcement of floodplains. The NFIP program, which is the National Flood Insurance Program, was a major game changer for us.
By the 1980s, the federal government had developed flood maps to guide where property owners could get subsidized flood insurance and where cities should not allow new development.
And then we took that as our minimum, and we've actually gone beyond that and have established within the city of Tulsa regulatory floodplains that are city enforced, that are more stringent than the FEMA flood maps and the FEMA floodplains.
The implication there then, or the result is that there's more areas that you're restrictive about what you can build.
So this is one of those things that I think a lot of people kind of get confused about sometimes. You can be anti-flood and still be pro-development. You just need to be pro-smart development. And that's really what we've done, is we've looked at ways that we can develop smarter, making sure that any sort of neighborhood that is developed has flood retention, that we're adding adequate drainage into areas, and that we are looking at the amount of impervious area that's added in by roads, by rooftops, by housing, and creating an equal amount of offset. Water is going to want to go somewhere. You need to give it a channel and a way to get out of the way, making sure that we're designating areas for the water to go. We've also fully recognized there's mistakes that were made in the past of where we allowed development to go or how we allowed development to go. And so we instituted, starting after the 1984 flood, a very aggressive buyout program for houses that were in the floodplain that, if they were being built today, would probably have never been allowed to be built. And so we would buy those properties out, demolish them, and revert them to green space. As a result, Tulsa now has 138 parks throughout our community. The bigger role they play that most people don't recognize or understand is those are flood detention areas where water collects and builds, so that it's not building and collecting in somebody's front yard or in their living room.
And crucially, says Kralachek, the city added a new fee on utility bills to create a dedicated funding source for flood damage prevention. Tulsa was only 2 years into its new flood prevention efforts when another disastrous deluge hit in 1986, further cementing the city's commitment to keep at it. By the time Kralachek took over Tulsa's emergency management in 2018, the city had 30 years of flood damage prevention under its belt, but it had yet to be seriously tested by nature. In 2019, it was.
Now let's check back in with Fox 23 Chief Meteorologist James Adelot with the latest track of the storms, bringing even more rain to us.
A new flash flood emergency issued for Tulsa, and a big part of
I had
the metro area
2 rivers and 3 creeks and streams at or above flood stage within my county at the same time for 12 days. It was the longest flood event we've had.
And it was a payoff moment, says Kralachek.
Within the city of Tulsa, I didn't have any homes that were impacted by the Arkansas River flood. I did have some homes within the city of Tulsa that took aerial flooding, which is flooding from just heavy rainfall. But the houses that were along the Arkansas River that back in '86 flooded were no longer there because we had bought those out. So it was just empty field. It was used primarily as a soccer practice field. That flooded. The water filled in there, water went away, nobody was hurt. Outside the city of Tulsa, I had hundreds of homes inundated.
A neighborhood called Town and Country was one of the worst hit in 2019. It's an unincorporated part of Tulsa that hadn't received the same flood prevention efforts.
In the Town and Country area, our sheriff's deputies were out there roping goats in the water, trying to get them out and to helping evacuate anything and everything that was living in the area. We had approximately 350 homes that took anywhere from 6 inches of water up to 8 feet of water in the home. And this was the Arkansas River, so this is, very sandy, silty water that was sitting in some of these homes for a week and a half to 2 weeks. We realized really quickly that several of these homes were built in what looks like an old, dried-out creek or riverbed. And so those were the homes that were the heaviest impact. Those were also the homes that were the last ones to drain out because the river in the past used to actually probably flow right through there. And so we've recognized that we should have never allowed those homes to be built there. And so we're working through HUD with utilizing funds that are called the Community Development Block Grant, which is a very common grant for local communities to use. But this one is earmarked specifically for disaster recovery. And we've secured $14.7 million, and we're in the process of actively buying out those homes. We're looking at buying probably about 50 to 60 of those homes, and we're going to demolish them to revert them back to green space so that the water has somewhere to go, recognizing we can't fight the river. The river is going to win. We have to learn to live with it.
How willing were the residents to get a buyout? They have to agree to it, right? You can't just eminent domain go in and say, we're buying you out, end of story.
As part of this program, I'm actually specifically forbidden from utilizing eminent domain. This has to be completely voluntary. Anybody who's there who might be a renter, for example, is eligible under what's called the Uniform Relocation Act, where if they're a renter, we have to help them find a different home, and we'll assist them with rent for up to 42 months in order to make it equitable for them as they're being forced out of the home because the owner might be selling it. Of the 350 homes in that neighborhood, we've had about 86 actually apply for assistance, which, given that this was now almost 5 years ago of that flood, is a tremendous number, because you have to remember, a lot of these people, they had to go through, and the way that you clean up after a flood that most people don't realize, you have to look where the high water mark was in the home and then go about 1 foot above that. Everything that is 1 foot down, you pull out of the house. Drywall, carpeting, appliances, furniture, cabinetry, basically your entire life that has been sitting in the river for a week and a half is going in the dumpster after that, and you have to rebuild. And so a lot of people, they've put blood, sweat, and tears into rebuilding their homes over these last 5 years. So the fact that we've gotten 86 individuals sign up for us to buy this out is a fantastic indicator of how much buy-in there actually was in the community.
How much do you pay what a buyer would pay?
We are actually legally required to pay fair market value of what the home was before it was damaged in the flood.
Okay, I was going to say, because you went ahead and let them rebuild, and I'm thinking you would have been smarter to try to buy them out when they were already underwater. You could pay less.
It's not really that I let them rebuild. It's their property. They get to rebuild if they so desire. And I told them right after the 2019 flood that we were going to pursue this and we were going to work on this. And I told them the average timeline on these is 5 to 7 years before you're going to see a buyout offer. We're right now at that 5-year mark, and the first offers are going out. So we're right on schedule with historically where these type of programs actually operate. I fully recognize and realize everybody has to have a place to live. And there's nowhere in my community that is going to be perfectly safe from disasters or even from flooding. And that's really an important thing that people don't realize, is that if you're where it can rain, you're where it can flood.
Is that why you think people do choose to rebuild even when they've been through 1 or 2 catastrophic floods? Because they figure, well, it's an act of God. It could happen anywhere, I guess. So I may as well build right here where I've lived for 15 or 20 years.
And we did have some people that have done that in the Town and Country area. This is a neighborhood that flooded back in the 1986 flood. And the fact that they rebuilt that first time and then flooded again in 2019 and chose to rebuild again. And some of that is resiliency of those people that they love where they live. They love the character of their neighborhood. And some of it is just, as human beings, we're not very good at figuring out and understanding risk. There's entire industries and casinos are built around the idea that we don't understand risk.
Are the flood insurance payouts, though, typically enough to rebuild?
The flood insurance program is designed to help you rebuild. That typically will cover up to $250,000 in construction costs, and then an extra $100,000 in interior, so replacing things such as your furniture.
Are there homes in this town and country neighborhood that didn't have flood insurance?
Unfortunately, there were, and this is one of the big problems that I see time and time again, is they were told, "Oh, you're not in the floodplain, you don't need the insurance."
Told by a realtor,
told by the realtors,
seller,
told at title, told by the lender when they're doing the mortgage. They're given incomplete information that, yes, they don't legally have to have flood insurance if they're outside the floodplain, but you still need to have that flood insurance. And we actually, in Tulsa, in the city of Tulsa, have the cheapest flood insurance in the country, despite having history being the most flood-prone city. And we still see year after year flood insurance drop because people believe that it won't happen to them.
Much as Kralachek is eager to see people in his community move out of the flood zone, he also admits there's a real downside for cities pursuing buyouts.
And this is one of the big obstacles that communities face, is it really kind of becomes a lose-lose for locals, because you're losing the tax base by removing a home. You're no longer going to be able to be getting property taxes from that property. Then you're losing again because you've suddenly gained this property that's in the middle of a neighborhood that you're going to have to upkeep and maintain for forever. And so that's going to be an ongoing cost. And so what we've really kind of tried to do is to find beneficial uses for that. Like, for example, there's a property that is right next to the river that we're looking at purchasing, that if we get that, would probably be just allowed to revert back to natural green space. The Arkansas River in this part of the county is a bald eagle nesting territory. And so we could donate that over to the Nature Conservancy. There's also some large areas that we've looked at purchasing through this buyout that might be converted into a park. Another thing we've looked at doing is we can, once we put that easement on it, surplusing it out and selling it to the neighbors.
But they couldn't build a bigger house. Right. They could just have a big yard.
They have a big yard, which is very desirable for a lot of folks that live out in the country. And so we're lessening that population density. We're lessening the impact of rainfall over the area because we have less impervious area to deal with. And so we're still reaching that ability to mitigate the risk of the area, but we're doing so in such a way as to not incur a tremendous loss for future generations into the county.
Joseph Kralachek heads the Tulsa Area Emergency Management Agency. In 2022, Tulsa became only the second city in the nation after Roseville, California, to achieve the National Flood Insurance Program's highest possible rating for reducing flood damage. There's a place in eastern North Carolina where moving to higher ground would mean moving the whole town.
Because of our historical significance, we just can't pack up and move.
This is Bobby Jones, who got rescued by helicopter during the catastrophic flood caused by Hurricane Floyd in 1999. Today he's
the mayor of the oldest town chartered by Blacks in America, Princeville, North Carolina. In 1865, after the Civil War, of course, our forefathers came across the Tar River Bridge, which is adjacent right here in Princeville, to absolute but swampland, where it was given to them because nobody thought it could be developed. And it was close to Tarboro, so we could continue to work for the former slave masters. And they had nothing, they had no education, but they had their God-given gifts and talents. And they started a community called Freedom Hill. 20 years later, we petitioned Congress to change the name from Freedom Hill to Princeville, after one of the founders, Turner Prince. Originally, we were told we will be allowed to incorporate, but the name would be Garfield after the 20th president of the United States. Our forefathers stood firm and said, no, we're going to name it after Turner Prince. And here we are today in 2024 is the town of Princeville.
Princeville is a poignant example of something that has played out across the U.S. for generations. Through segregation and then discriminatory lending practices, people of color were pushed into the least desirable parts of communities, prone to problems like flooding. With climate change, that risk is growing. Would Princeville's founders have chosen a less swampy spot out of the flood zone? Maybe. But they weren't given the choice.
I think we flooded every time it rained hard. But after 1967, a levee was built to protect against the majority of the floods.
Now that they were safe from perpetual inundation, Princeville began to prosper as a small, majority Black community of a few thousand residents who mostly worked and shopped over in Tarboro across the Tar River.
Until 1999, of course. And that's when Floyd came through and destroyed the entire town.
Was there any serious talk about not rebuilding Princeville after the devastation of Floyd?
Yes. As a matter of fact, there was a vote cast by the board I was not a part of the board in 1999. It was 2 to move, 2 to stay. So the mayor broke the tie and decided to stay. And we're so thankful that she made that deciding vote.
The Jones family rebuilt their home after Floyd, but Bobby left for work elsewhere in North Carolina. About a decade later, he returned and became Princeville's mayor. This was 2013. Flooding was not on his list of priorities at that point. Everyone thought Hurricane Floyd had been a once-in-a-lifetime disaster. They were wrong.
They started announcing it on the news.
October 2016, Hurricane Matthew was heading toward Princeville.
We rode through the whole town, telling people it's time to get out. Even though the sun was shining outside, flood was coming. Get out now. And a couple of people said, it's not coming again. I said, get out now. And thankfully, everybody listened and everybody got out safely. I had the opportunity to fly over in the helicopter just to observe. And it was just, seems like we were in another world. There were boats on the water, on the main street that you could reach up and touch the stoplights. We went on a boat ride to my home. And it was just unreal.
Once again, Princeville was under pressure to relocate rather than rebuild.
The state wanted us to move. They purchased land, 53 acres, and they wanted us to move the town hall and all the municipal facilities to the 53 acres. But with the understanding that if we move, and God forbid another storm come through, the next time they probably would not assist the homeowners. So they wanted the homeowners to move out there as well. But we explained to them the importance of rebuilding in Princeville proper. Our forefathers didn't shed their blood, sweat, and tears on the 53 acres. They shed their blood, sweat, and tears on Princeville proper to build a town to call their own, where they wouldn't have to worry about racism and discrimination. We needed to be here to preserve the legacy of our forefathers. These are sacred grounds.
Unlike in 1999, when Princeville officials rejected any federal funding to relocate, this time around they agreed to let residents take buyout money. A handful have chosen that option. A few dozen more got federal disaster funds to rebuild their homes up on blocks or stilts. Mayor Jones says some Princeville residents left for good, but just as quickly, new residents came to take their place.
We have a lot of people coming from out of Princeville that don't know the history. They're just coming for the cost of living. There's a lot of construction going on in the flood zone at this particular time.
And they don't all have to be up on stilts or anything like that?
Nope, it's their choice. We give them that choice. We have a young lady that moved down from Connecticut. She built a beautiful new home, not elevated, but again, it's her choice.
Does she even have,
yeah.
I mean, can you even get flood insurance in that part of town?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
As a matter of fact, her family lives here, so she knows of the flood situation. She knows extremely well. So, but she wanted to be here. That's why we're so adamant that they do something with the levee now, because we're spending millions of dollars, and we don't want to see those millions of dollars wasted.
He's referring to the levee that was initially built to protect Princeville from the Tar River back in 1967. After the flood in 2016, Congress authorized a plan to extend the levee and appropriated $40 million for it. But in June 2023, the Army Corps of Engineers called off the project because it would make flooding worse for other communities on the river.
Unfortunately, they've been studying this levee for 23 plus years, and they still don't have an answer. Very discouraging, because I know we just landed on the moon. We have tunnels underwater. So for them to tell us they have no clue of how to protect the town of Princeville without having an adverse effect on surrounding communities, I find that hard to believe. But they're not giving up, which is a good thing, but they have to start back from scratch with money. They're talking about either building a reservoir or a diversion channel. Either one is fine. Just make sure we don't flood again. Thankfully, we have not lost one life from the town of Princeville because of those disasters. But to lose everything again for the third time would be devastating, because we realize the mental drain, the mental impact it's having on our citizens. So we're trying to do everything we possibly can to make sure that that does not happen again. Now, that being said, global warming is real. So we have to address global warming at some point. It's past that point, because it's not just Princeville, it's Miami, it's California, it's New York, New Jersey, you name it. Flooding risks are growing each and every day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you recognize that reality, is there any scenario where, I mean, it may be possible that there aren't enough big enough dams or levees. I mean, is there any scenario in which you could imagine accepting Princeville having to relocate, or no longer being, a town because the rivers have risen too much or the storms have become too intense and the losses are too great?
Only if there's a loss of life. Material things can be replaced. Life cannot.
Yeah. What gives you hope for the future of Princeville?
I see the resilience of my people, especially the seasoned senior citizens who were born and raised in the town of Princeville. And when I can make them smile, that makes my job much easier. I wake up each morning with a smile on my face, even in the circumstances that we are in, even in this world that seems like it's falling apart around us. My strength comes from when I pick up my Holy Bible and I read it on a daily basis, and I fall down on my knees and I pray for not only Princeville, but our world and our universe to become better. And it's possible.
Mayor Bobby Jones of Princeville, North Carolina, thank you so much for your time today, Mayor.
Thank you so much.
Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by Vanessa Goodman and me, with help from James Hoops, Samuel Benson, and Sam Payne. Our sound design and audio engineering team includes Kelsey Ney, Brandon Lewis, and Trent Reimschissel. And make sure to check out our Stick With It conversation series over on the Top of Mind podcast feed. It's where we talk with people about how they're practicing staying open and curious when faced with a perspective or a situation that challenges them. Maybe a Top of Mind episode has done that for you recently. I'd love to hear about it. Email topofmind@byu.edu. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.